where those who perceive truth may strive to make others see.
A big, powerful America, and shoot them for what?
On that continent, we are trying to forge a new identity for which we need each other.
I want you to imagine that your mother sends you to the grocery store to pick up, let's say, bananas. She sends you with about $2 to get somewhere around the usual 2 pounds. All right, so you should have some change left over. And you get to the store, and you pick up the bananas, and you go to the cashier, and they ring you up, but the total is really closer to $10. When you're confused, so you look and try to see what's been rung up, and when you see it's just the bananas, you ask, why so much? And they inform you that the price of bananas had to raise due to sanctions on countries in Central and South America. So, today we're talking about sanctions in the Renaissance, right? And we'll be referencing The Art of Sanctions by Richard Nephew, and also we'll be talking a little bit about the end as well, talking a little bit about current events at the end as well. I'll try to tag that for the videos on YouTube. When it comes down to this particular book, though, by Richard, he made this from his own personal experience in designing sanctions for the U.S. In particular to impose on Iran. And in terms of sanctions, this way and this method of really described in this book is really it contributes to the idea, the title, right? The title, like being the art of sanctions, and it needs to really, in order to really be most effective, we should think of it as an art, because these are people at play, right? So we can't we can't just look at and really deduce this down to looking at some kind of sheet of numbers, even though numbers are of course going to be effective. But in terms of actually how sanctions are designed, we should definitely think of them as just as much of an art as a science, in terms of how we view the idea of sanctions. And in terms of like the current events, it's February 7th as I'm recording this, and the Trump administration, or Trump himself, has really gone on to talk about about imposing sanctions on various countries. Many of these countries have really long-standing relationships with the U.S., and it could, it could definitely affect a lot of what we interface with on a daily basis. And I'm gonna try to hold the conspiracy theorists at bay with with some of this stuff, and I'll try to keep it down to simply just talking about how the U.S. really imposed and how the sanctions in general really function. But it does appear that we should be prepared for the things that we interface with on an everyday basis to fluctuate a lot more than what they've done in the past. The introduction story, I think, is something that we should definitely be aware of. I'm not sure. I believe it is. I believe we do get our bananas from somewhere in South America, but I haven't looked into that specifically in Central or South America. But I do know that there is a company. They are active in Central America and South America. That's why I use that particular analogy for the story. Now, in terms of sanctions, right? We call it sanctions when we're really looking for a way to influence a country that isn't military action, I would say. And this is economics is going to be huge, right? And a lot of people would say this is kind of they may say something like, oh, this is more economic in nature. And the idea is sanctions is kind of it's a step up when you sanction, because the idea of tariffs would apply particularly to taxing goods. But when you tax goods from a country in general, from an entire country, you call it sanctions. And in terms of this idea of sanctions being kind of I'll say sanctions being a strategy, it really does come down to influencing a country without military actions. And there's a lot of appeal to this because, well, one, you don't have to invest the lives of your people into this particular conflict, and it's also in terms of the effect of sanctioning a country. They don't necessarily they're not as immediately apparent, right? So you can't really directly correlate a lot of chaos that a sanction likely is or could be responsible for to the sanctions itself, or the sanctioner or the sanctioning country, right? So it has a lot of appeal, and in terms of doing this versus military action, right? Especially, and it kind of sets it says a lot, right? Because one of the ways in which we can really define a civilization is the believe it or not, the prevalence or the concentration of politicians in a country, and and that is very counter to the idea of a lot of what I would, before actually embarking on this particular journey. Before I would do that, it was a conflict, right? Because civilized society being kind of directly correlated with the prevalence of politicians, you kind of have a lot of people would have kind of an understanding of politicians being corrupt by nature, and that right there is the transformation in terms of what they do have a function. They do have a function, and I think we simply have a system that selects for really the worst, and in terms of the people who are who would essentially do for the what do we call them, the upper class, rather than for everyone. And this to say, basically, the idea of sanctions having more appeal, being kind of directly correlated to society. This is the prevalence of politicians in a society kind of it lets you know that it lets kind of the world know that you come to understand that everything cannot be attained through war and conflict, and that's really something that is it's very, very important today, more so, and it's going to grow more and more important, right? And the idea of sanctions, when you understand kind of when you understand sanctions, you have to realize that this is only possible through having a really a more in-depth understanding of the country being sanctioned or the target of these sanctions, right? And we really, like, Richard goes on and really has like a lot of, most of the book is really around the idea of, sanctions and, how a country can, react to sanctions. And really, I think it helps us develop an understanding of the design itself, the design process, and I think it is linked directly to a deeper understanding of the country being sanctioned, as well as your own, of course, right? So, and that is something that we have to really, really dig deep on in terms of understanding, like, and reacting to the idea of sanctions. And resolve is also a factor that Richard brings up and he talks about, and this idea of resolve. This is directly correlated with this idea of it being an art, right? Because if you can't really put this on a number sheet, you can't put this on a graph, you can't really put a number behind the resolve. And there's this is a very real factor, though, right? Because when it comes down to people and culture, you have to understand that there's an element of resolve that is in that is baked into certain countries and certain cultures, right? So, and the leaders of those countries and those cultures have to carry that, and they have to kind of stand on those particular platforms that are built on the element of resolve many times, right? And the idea of this, I feel like this gives more strength to the idea of this being more of an art than people may, surface level understand. In terms of, just to give you guys an idea, in terms of Iraq, there was apparently there's kind of an agreement where, like, international investigators were sent in to verify status, or there's an international kind of a, I guess we'll call it, third party association with really keeping track of nuclear weapons, and they refused the investigators of this third party coming in and kind of giving more understanding to the nuclear weapons that takes place and that's taken place, right? There is in terms of like this idea of Iraq and what's happened in Iraq, there was a very real there's a very real effect because um, there was no mass, there were no mass weapons of destruction. I'm sorry if that's news to anybody, but there were none. But in terms of yielding to the idea of international investigators, that was more symbolic of well, exactly that, yielding to kind of this idea of really more powerful nations being able to influence you in this particular way, and you having to simply in a way prostrate yourself for a lot of these guys when it comes down to the way that we are. We are absolute like bullies abroad, right? So this is kind of where my past conspiracy selves kind of made more sense for the world in terms of what I'm seeing with like things like WikiLeaks and things like that. Like, we have a history of bullying countries. We have a history of really being bullies, particularly in the Middle East, right? And they did not want to do that, and their resolve was so high that our sanctions didn't have the impact of didn't have an impact or an effective impact in terms of getting them to yield to international investigators. And this was a very real conflict that took place, right? So like this led to, for those that don't know the reference, when it came down to claiming that there were, weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East, this was how we sent people off. This is how we sent soldiers to the Middle East, right? And their resolve was high enough to where it got to the point where that was it became a war. They ultimately their country is now in shambles because of this, right? And we kind of that idea of resolve. They were willing to die on this, and that's very, very that's very powerful, and I think it's a very important. That's Richard wants to really talk about this because it kind of has a tremendous impact on how we design sanctions in the future, right? And really develop our understanding in the future. In terms of this idea of designing sanctions, we need to have a solid understanding of the idea of what's the idea of a sanction is to deal in really the idea of pain, right? So increasing and decreasing pain. And this idea of designing a sanction, there needs to essentially be off-ramps for people, for countries, right? When you design a sanction the right way, and there needs to be an element to where a sanction can be designed to increase pain when the desired behavior is not achieved, or decrease pain, which is, this is crazy. I think it's crazy because it sounds like literal torture language, right? So, but this is what we're talking about. Like, I remember when this is something with the Pentagon Papers. Daniel Ellsberg's, I think his wife read the Pentagon Papers, which was like how we treated, or our lessons and a realistic outlook of what was happening in Vietnam being hid, it was hid from Americans for a long time, and everybody lied. But the idea of Daniel Ellsberg, his wife came in and she was in tears because it was just like, they're designing they're talking about, the idea of, pain in Vietnam and putting a country in pain. This is literal torture language, like that they're talking like they're torturing a person, and that was kind of, it's crazy, but it is that in terms of it is to be thought of, like you are attempting, or that you are trying to torture a country or person in a certain way, and apply pain in a certain way that is in a certain you can easily begin to become more accurate for the you can easily fill the role of the torturer in a more accurate and increasingly accurate in terms of that analogy. It's definitely something that we should understand more in terms of that idea of what we do. But creating off-ramps, very important, right? So like in terms of this idea of an off-ramp, right, of designing a sanction, not to simply, that sanction needs to be designed in a way to where it's not by itself. It's not by itself in terms of imposing a sanction isn't something that is simply increase. You want to have it to where you can analyze, and it's very important to analyze how the country responds, what it does, and what happens, in terms of the economics, the business industries, the people, the society itself, right? How does it shape and form, right? Because a lot of times they're not going to, like, a country isn't going to simply say, oh, okay, this sanction is going to, like, I'm going to accept this sanction because that's what they imposed on me. Sometimes they'll take that particular, we'll use this analogy, pain. We'll take that pain and we'll absorb it in this way, or we'll, adjust this way. And there's some situations to where I think it was in Iran. They really, they adjusted sanctions, I believe, on the oil and gas imported into the country, and they ended up the way they responded ended up being an improvement for their economy, because they retrofitted factories to produce and really to really refine and produce oil, and they became, and that was kind of a way they that didn't take everything, in terms of that didn't take the entire brunt of the actual sanctions for them not being able to get oil and gas, and they never produced as much as they imported, but it did help, and it made that pain more bearable. Now, in terms of this idea of creating off ramps, like I said, it's an art, right? So like when you impose the sanctions, having that link to, like, okay, the pain can increase or decrease if you do this. It's a very important thing, because you want to, like, have the way in which it's really, it feels like a chess game, right? So like you want to make sure, like, hey, this particular we can end this if you do this, and if you don't do that, then we'll increase the pain. And now there is kind of an understanding, like, there's a, this can have more of an effect than I think. There's a very that is a very it's very psychological in itself, in terms of even though some sanctions aren't necessarily expressed, right? And if it is expressed, sometimes that's strategic in terms of the message that you receive. And it gets complicated. It does get complicated, and it does get to where having someone impose sanctions. This is, in terms of having a desired result, having effective sanctions, they should most certainly be related to off-ramps, right? So creating off-ramps for people to completely take away the pain or decrease the pain, right? So that's a very, very important, right? So you don't want to assume that it's either your way or nothing, because a lot of times that may be the case. You get nothing out of your particular sanctions, and you do want to and leave kind of a leeway room for a decrease in pain, rather than necessarily keeping this particular keeping on with all or nothing. And you want that because a lot of times the countries will there's a situation to where, like, there was the economic relationship between, like, that country and neighbors. That an option for them was to increase that particular economic relationship, and that would lead them to be more susceptible to the influence of sanctions in the future. When you decide, like, if you decided to put sanctions on, if you decided to put sanctions on them in another particular way, very, very much, like I said, a chess game with what happens here. Now, you should understand that in terms of with this particular investigation, right? This idea of designing a sanctions, there needs to be a very thorough process here, right? So, being able to analyze the country is one thing. Analyzing how that country relates to other countries, that's another thing. That's another element here, right? Because when it comes down to sanctions, the most effective sanctions are going to be really through relationships, right? So how can these relationships be used to get them to adhere to this particular behavior in some way, shape, or form? That's very, very much that becomes more important, right? And countries build more, like, in terms of the idea of building relationships, building networks, those are not to be underestimated in no way, shape, or form, because this is how economics works. You build relationships with other countries. The whole import-export, business is really on a dynamic of having a strong relationship. The UN is it's something, because it's a tool that is it represents a shared relationship between a network of countries, right? And having a certain standing in the UN, it's a status symbol for a lot of these countries and a lot of these the people who lead these countries, right? So that's going to be something that is representative of a lot. And when it comes down to the idea of sanctions, the UN does play a part, even in its existence in general, right? Being able to sit down at that table is powerful for for a lot of people, and during those and being, kind of having that understanding between those in those meetings. But there's also an element of this idea of these network of countries. When somebody does something that is kind of internationally unfavorable, then there's an understanding that, hey, we kind of, for instance, Russia was involved with the sanctions in Iran, and normally you would think that, okay, Russia's also a bad guy if you're, kind of NPC, just American, right? And you think, like, how can we use a relationship with somebody who is supposed to be our enemy, right? And that's the thing. Like, internationally, they all sat at that table. They all have that agreement with one another to say that, and to influence countries and influence behaviors. And they played a big part. And it's something that allows people to put aside differences for a larger cause in some ways, right? Because, this idea of, nuclear weapons, you don't want that in the hands of, let's say, military dictators in a way, or, people who don't necessarily, like, have the best interests of the world in mind. And this, it could easily lead to problems for Russia if nuclear weapons begin to go off in close to their particular border, right? So even so, more problems for them than us in a lot of ways. So this idea of networking is so profound in terms of having and designing a sanction. Even outside of the UN, the U.S. Reached across to certain particular allies. I want to say China was involved, but it just became something to where these, this relationship building process extended beyond the idea of what the UN was willing to do and able to do. And the economics, right? The U.S. dollar, and how we do things abroad. It's our influence abroad, right? So despite of kind of us being absolute monsters abroad, we really do want to maintain a level of influence, in terms of influence even in the repair of the damage that a lot of times we would be blamed for, right? So we want to make sure that this is this is going to be a situation of this is going to be a renaissance and not a revolution when we do repair society, or when we do repair a lot of these societies. And these ideas of sanctioning countries, you want to, when you have that vision for particular, even if it is a vision of, rather than an ideal of, oh, this can be, we can do something great here, it can be something like, oh, you don't want this person to, essentially just kind of the baseline for our country now, like, oh, we just make people react with fear, and we'll create that in a way. And with these sanctions, there does seem to be kind of a fear of not maintaining peace, international peace, right? And when you paint that picture, a lot of entities that you're trying to convince to help you sanction, whatever country, they'll go the extra mile for you, and they'll there was a situation to where they wanted to essentially make it really uncomfortable to do business in the currency of Iran. And in this particular way, they shaped it. They shaped the narrative. And despite how accurate it is, this idea of Iran having nuclear weapons could lead to kind of the disruption of international peace. And the banks involved, they responded more like people than companies, right? So they responded like actual, okay, we don't want to really be responsible for X, Y, and Z, and they went the extra mile. And you found out, a lot of what was being purchased, and what was being shipped in some cases, and that was just to where people wanted to wash their hands of what could have, what they could have had, or what they could be responsible for in the future. Now, the idea of sanctions in general, you want to understand that, like I said, public statements, they could easily be there to be understood as really, they're to be understood as more than just the surface level, right? So what response are you looking for out of this? And I mean, it comes back to chess, and I think it does. We will see a lot of that in terms of with the, a developed understanding of sanctions, and the idea of emphasizing, what could be brought to the or what could be kind of shown at the surface level is it could be useful, right? So even when you're looking at data, fake data, right? So someone's publishing how much the oil consumption in some way, and they're fudging the numbers, so because they know that they're in sanctions, right? So whether they're told told or not told, right? So they know that these are going to be looked at by a third party in some way, shape, or form. And even fudging the numbers sometimes could be useful, right? So like if you, if your numbers are absolutely outstanding, then then you could look as like, wow, this is this is definitely fake, and that is a message in itself that they had to fake that particular data. It's very, very. It gets so complex in terms of with a lot of these sanctions, of course, and this is. I feel like this is starting to understand, like the chessboard, the chessboard on a world stage. It becomes very much very, very complex very fast, right? So and having those understandings are going to be really, really useful. Now during sanctions, the Richard, he also talks about this idea of this idea of how pressure could build in a country, and a lot of times when you sanction a country and you observe that country and you you want to of course observe that country while it's under sanctions, and understand how that particular country is responding to the sanctions, right? Are they increasing prices at the stores? How are the people responding to those prices being increased, X, Y, and Z? Because when it comes down to a lot of these leaders, there could be, you want there to be an understand that they could only be in place because of the regular people that decide to vote them in a lot of cases. If you're looking at countries that aren't dictatorships, and that is, it's a way, right? Because if you know that this particular sanction is affecting everyday people in a democratic society, then there's going to be that pressure build up to essentially, for the leader to respond in a way that's more favorable to the people who are sanctioning them. That could, you want that to definitely happen when in certain situations, right? Because and there's also the element of overreach that Richard talks about, because you don't want a humanitarian crisis, right? You don't, and there's a balance that you have to play there, because the idea of it almost seems like they've kind of created this threshold of when applying pain becomes torture, right? And that kind of seems like the proper analogy for this idea of you want to apply enough pain without causing a humanitarian crisis. And that's definitely something that you want to definitely think about, not just in terms of how the world will view you, in terms of the sanctioning country, but also the idea of the scars that you leave behind. We don't want to create more quote-unquote terrorists for our particular for this particular country here, right? And a lot of times when you do that, when you design sanctions, it could lead to that. The idea of Pearl Harbor was, many would attribute that to the oil embargo that the U.S. imposed on Japan before in the years before, and that particular understanding between Japan's like, okay, the overreaching there was, it was clearly a situation to where they had a bad taste in their mouth for the United States. And also with Germany, apparently, like, we had demands that the German people provide reparations, and I think this is during the First World War, and they created a bad taste. That could have created a bad taste in their mouth in terms of it wasn't really a repair, it was just punishment. It wasn't really about repairing society, it was more about punishment. And I think a lot of societies understand that, especially this wasn't about like kind of like trying to help us, or not really help us, but really trying to correct our course for your gains. It went down into, this is a punishment, and you can leave a stain with a lot of people and create more problems for yourself and your country as a result. This idea of also like creating a bad taste. You don't want to create, rather than this being immediately bad for your country in terms of what could lead to in the future. creating more isolated countries, right? So if a sanction makes a country more isolated, then that could lead to more humanitarian issues, one, but also more issues in terms of like disregarding that international understanding between countries, right? So like, we need to have that, right? So like in North Korea, and for those that don't know, North Korea is kind of like the outlaw of the countries abroad, and I mean I'm not in any way, shape, and form like trying to blame them. I think we've we've done our fair part to really create that in a lot of ways, but in terms of the idea of North Korea, like they became a more isolated state because we tried to really sanction them in a certain way, and they did not respond well. Of course, like, when it comes down to nuclear weapons, there is proof that they do have, like, very real, tangible proof that they do have nuclear weapons, and they will test them, and they are testing them. You know what I'm saying? Like, this isn't just hearsay and fluff, right? And they actually have, like, also, like, when it came down to the idea of reacting to the sanctions, people, the common people, they bore the brunt of the sanctions, right? So it may have, like, in terms of that particular society, it created a more isolated society, and people were willing to create, or were willing to bear the brunt, and whether it's a situation of a dictatorship or not, they were willing to bear that brunt. And they also had situations where they built like underground tunnels, and they were like kidnapping leaders in the field, and gaining knowledge that way too. It was, I mean, obviously we got the outlaw in terms of countries. We did not. We got to like North Korea. For those that like don't know, like there's like a like their nuclear understanding is, hey. Like, that's literally it. Like, hey, don't F with us, and we won't F with you, or don't make us think that we'll benefit from using these. It's just like, I've never seen such a country just be like, I am. Not only would you invading my country lead to a likely nuclear war, if you do anything shady, like I'm just picturing like the guy in the corner that is like shaking, and he has a gun and he's pointing it at everybody. He's just like, hey, like we can get this started and whenever you want. Whenever, but I mean it's not funny, but it's kind of, it's crazy. They're a very small country, but they don't care. And like I said, when you've seen like how the West has kind of acted abroad, you kind of have more of an understanding of the idea of what these countries turn into, right? So like we even the pressures that we put on Russia led to Vladimir Putin, so we don't really have too much. I mean, we ourselves have disagreed, have literally trampled over international agreements with this quote-unquote war on terror, right? So there are agreements that we simply stayed out of, and that is, we got a problem. We simply do have a problem in terms of our understanding between our kind of balancing between violating international peace and going in and like in trying to hold other people accountable. We're towing a very sensitive line there. And like in terms of a tremendous shift in like ideology, when we view people who design sanctions, we should understand them as more so maze builders, right? So the people who create mazes for whatever target sanctions that we have, right? So the idea of like the idea of what we do and how we impact other people, it does need to be a concept of this is a maze that we want people to, or we have an understanding of how they will navigate, what they will do, how they will respond. Those are going to be very important. So when it comes to the idea of sanctions right now, I think it's very important for us to really have an understanding. As of today, February 7th, 2025, we do have we have had a recent situation take place, which the United States or the Trump administration placed sanctions on Mexico and Canada, or they threatened to place sanctions on these particular countries, which would really be long-standing. We've had long-standing relationships with them, if you can't imagine. And the idea was, I think it was 25% tariffs on goods come in there, and there's been some 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 of the logic behind this is like, okay, we have an overinflated military budget, and so nobody thinks about attacking us, and they don't have that same military budget, but they benefit off of ours in terms of if somebody attacks them, then they know that we'll respond. And that's kind of so far that's kind of been the only real defense that I've heard of in this particular situation. But in terms of the idea of whether it's right or wrong, I think it's really important to know and be prepared for the idea of what happens as a result. And in Iran, they built up the oil and gas industries after they were sanctioned. And the idea here is that the United States will somehow become more self-reliant, and you don't want to leave that to so let's say, for instance, these billionaires, they know exactly how they want to respond to sanctions to where it'll benefit them more. That can lead, or that could lead to something that isn't necessarily more favorable for you, right? And that can easily turn into a legitimate problem, in terms of when they decide to, or how these billionaires being responsible for what happens and how we stabilize. But in terms of ourselves and communities and how we respond as communities, I do think we like the idea of whether if you, let's say that you're completely anti-Trump, the idea is don't be anti-Trump to where you're going to to where I'm going to suffer and make sure to where you're going to make sure that you suffer as loud as possible, that's not a response, that's not a valid response in any way. And I think we should understand and build up and understand how we should build up our own self-resiliency in a lot of ways, and that's going to I think in a lot of situations that's going to lead to people becoming more business oriented and really trying to maybe collectively business, maybe having more collective business, collective businesses that are kind of more healthy for the actual surrounding community, right? This idea of what happens, I think, is going to be important for everybody and more people to not be stagnant and wait. I think a lot of us, when it came down to the oil and gas industry in Iran, they retrofitted current factories, and I think we should have that mindset as well in terms of understanding how we should or how we can respond. And we all have our own strengths and weaknesses with our relationships and our own individual skills, but I do think it's going to be important in general. And always try to build relationships anyway. I think that's one of the most underrated in terms of survival. When it comes down to survival in general, I think that's going to be very important. Now, in terms of this idea of you want to have more economic and build more economic awareness, right? And this is going to be like through a lot of different ways, right? But for some examples, there's an Institute for Supply Management. They can give you, they can provide reports on what happens. There's also the Global Supply Chain Council, and also the Supply Chain Digital Magazine and two more. We have Logistics Management Publication and the Supply Chain News Portal, or Supply Chain Brain News Portal. Those are ways that you can kind of like start to, just some examples for starting to kind of gather more information, right? Now, also you want to, track public statements from the sanctioned countries, right? So with this particular situation, there was a response, I think, from Canada saying that they would target, particular states that were pro-Trump. And there's a response from Mexico, and the response from Mexico, I think, was like they'd also tax our goods, and it didn't look favorable from either end. In terms of another thing is investment diversification is going to be something that may be more important as we go into the future, right? So this is resources include Financial Times market data, Wall Street Journal markets section, the Morningstar investment research, Bloomberg markets, MSCI Global Sanctions Index as well. And when it comes down to looking at the economic shifts abroad, the World Bank currency or country reports, the IMF country information, the Economist Intelligence Unit, the Regional Development Bank reports, trading economics database as well, information gathering. You also want to make, like, in terms of just keeping updates to sanctions in general, the UN has a Security Council sanctions committees. You can keep track doing that. Also, the EU has a sanctions map. The OFAC has a sanctions list. And there's also Financial Action Task Force updates, as well as the World Bank sanction system. In terms of the public statements and keeping track of public statements, some examples would be Reuters International, Associated Press, Global News, Foreign Policy Magazine, Local News, Target Language, diplomatic mission statements as well. And also, when it comes down to just economic impact analysis in general, we have the Peterson Institute for International Economics, the International Crisis Group Reports, the Brookings Institute Analysis, the Council on Foreign Relations Brief, and the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And these are some resources that could help you stay in the loop in terms of what's happening, and outside of what's happening, and of course, please stay updated in terms of your current environment. I think that's probably the most important thing in terms of understanding and building those relationships. In terms of what's happening right now, I am not very hopeful about where a lot of this leads. And I do think that the idea of pain being increasing pain for, society in general, I think we should start to realize that may be something that we may face. And I really hope that people outside, or people who listen to this, start to really, prepare more and realize there is not going to be one person that comes in and saves the entire population, right? So that idea, I think, is false. I think we really have there's going to have to be people in society that get together and respond rather than react. And with that being said, do the YouTube stuff, like, comment, share, comment any thoughts on sanctions, as well as what ideas that you have about kind of sanctions in general. I'm not gonna tell you what to post, but I mean, if you more so just what we can do to respond is more so what I'm interested in. Not really talking about the current administration, and what you've seen individuals and communities do to respond. And with that being said, thank you. Hope to see you soon.